UFC 270 just happened this past weekend. What a way to start off the year, Michael. And still, Francis Ngannou, we got amazing fights that happened this past weekend. We got some juicy drama going on. We got a lot to talk about, but we got to start with and still Francis Ngannou. 5-round decision. We're talking last week about some wrestling that could be used to advantages and this and that. But really, in the back of our minds, I know me and you are both thinking these guys are going to go out there and they're probably going to have mostly a stand-up fight. And we saw Francis have to dig deep and use some wrestling and flip the script. We had injuries. What are your thoughts just starting off on the main event?
Well, first and foremost, Paul, I was in Anaheim, and I knew the
right.
second that I saw Francis Ngannou walk out with double knee sleeves on, I'm thinking this guy, he's going to wrestle this fight. I mean, you got to remember, this guy comes, originally he's from France, training with Ferdinand, Cyril's coach. But, he moves to Extreme Couture. And for people that don't know, Extreme Couture is a wrestling-heavy camp. So while we haven't seen Francis go out and utilize his wrestling in his fights because he doesn't have to, because he's got that blunt force trauma, one-punch knockout power that we love so much, you know that he's still training his wrestling being at Extreme Couture. So it's something that I think people have maybe neglected to think about just because that's the way he approaches his fights. He's primarily a stand-up guy. So what a smart way to game plan, especially given the circumstances, everything that's going on with the injury he sustained in his camp. That's what made it even more impressive. Is it's like he stepped out of his comfort zone, almost in a sense, when it comes to his skill set, and went out and wrestled this guy. But he did it with essentially a pretty toasted knee, Paul. I mean, that is impressive.
Yeah, it's so impressive, man. But I'm telling you, I've been talking to Eric Nixick all the way before this fight was even officially booked. And he's telling me, he's like, bro, I promise you, he's getting scary in the wrestling room because he wants to be there. He wants to learn. He wants to evolve. And he was so dedicated and so focused on that. Now, granted, I'm sure that the first game plan for them always, like we talked about, is to go out there and knock his freaking head off and use the blunt force trauma, like you talked about, to your advantage. But when that goes away and you've got somebody with great movement, you've got more experience, and you've been working on the wrestling the way he has, man, to see him have that in his back pocket, he's showing so much evolution so fast. The second Stipe fight goes out there and just shows a patience and a calmness. When you're that size and you hit that hard, that's scary. At least when Francis used to kind of panic strike, if he missed you and you could get him down, there was a chance you had in this fight. The more he shows these levels of MMA and his fight IQ, he's scary, man. If he can wrestle you and you can't take him down, he can dictate where the fight goes. If he keeps working on the cardio, he's obviously listening to his corner. He's hearing them. He's able to be in touch and be inspired. We'll get into that later with Eric Nixick in his speech, but that's a scary dude. I mean, I don't know who's out there that's going to challenge for that. I think that we know who the guy is, probably is John Jones, but is he even going to fight?
Yeah, that's a good question in itself. But, when you talk about Francis Ngannou's fight IQ, with good fight IQ comes good awareness, a good awareness of being in the octagon and being so in sync with being able to compete, but also pick up the what's going on in your opponent's corner, what's going on in your corner. And Francis said he had a moment, I believe it was in the third round, where he could hear Cyril Gane's cornering him, and Cyril wasn't responding. And Francis said, I knew at that moment he was broken because I have been there. And Francis said in the fight with Stipe Miocic, he had that moment where he was broken and his corner was trying to coach him through the fight. And he just was not responding. And I like that parallel that he brought up because essentially that is what we just witnessed, except it was two different guys. We saw Francis and Stipe fight the first time. We saw how the fight transpired. He got tired. He got broken by Stipe, and Stipe retained his title. It was like the same thing, except Francis was in the driver's seat this fight. Yeah. It was virtually the same thing. So it's cool to hear with Francis's evolution and his skill set comes his fight IQ. And that takes high fight IQ to be in a fight competing while listening to the corner. And Paul, I want to let you take the reins on the Eric Nixick speech because, while I know Eric Nixick pretty well, you've been in the training room with him. You're around him more. You understand a little more what goes on in this guy's mind. Walk us through the speech before the fifth round with Eric Nixick.
He has such an ability to connect with his fighters on a personal level. He's a big football guy, played football, coaching, and he brings that kind of NFL coaching mentality into it, right? He treats his room like that. He practice, he's very stern, but when he gets in the corner and he wants to get you motivated, and I experienced him when I fought RDA. I only had 5 days to get ready for that thing. But I got the chance to work with Eric Nixick because he was out in Vegas. We had built a relationship, and he's just so good at making you feel confident, making you believe in yourself, because he truly does, because he has put the work in as a coach. He's one of those guys, man. He's just inspiring. He's contagious. The energy is contagious when you're around him. And him just calling him Bubba, telling him that he believes in him, that he knows he can do this. He's used some other choice words for Francis that I won't use here on our YouTube podcast, but it gives you chills when you think about that. And Francis to be engaged and able to respond, that shows the level of connection that these guys have as fighter and coach. That's a rare thing. I mean, there's love there, right? Francis comes over to Eric's house and hangs out with Knox, his son. They're like buddies, man. You should see this. It's hilarious. You've got this little boy, and the baddest dude on the planet just wants to play soccer or play football and mess around. He makes sure he's eating his food when he comes over for dinner. So then when you slap that guy in the fourth, between the fourth and the fifth round in a corner like that, he's going to be able to connect to your soul. And Francis was able to go out and do what he did in that fifth round. I mean, it's incredible. And vice versa goes the other way. In Gan's corner, it's a double-edged sword out there, because yes, he knows Francis very well, his coach, but Francis knows what's going on. He knows that corner. He knows what the commands that are going to come out. I think it backfired a little bit. I know there was a lot of talk from the Cyril Gane corner about how they were going to have the advantage and this and that. And I just think it reared its ugly head that he also knows what's going on in that corner just a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that goes hand in hand with what I said before too, about how like Francis has been in that same situation. Ferdinand was in his corner against Stipe, so virtually it's the same situation. And talking about some of Gane dropping back for the leg lock, that being something that was a little suspect, and it kind of led me to think, like, the news started to kind of break about Francis's knee as fight week started to go on. And one thing that was pretty telling for people that don't know, I love to bet on fights. So I'm paying attention to this betting line in this Cyril Gane Francis fight. And I see that Francis, the line starts to shift, like he's becoming this big underdog. At one point, I think he got up to about a plus 140, plus 145. And I'm like, how is the champ becoming an underdog? And then on the tail end of that, I'm finding out that there's rumors about Francis having a knee injury. So, have you ever gone into a fight, Paul, being that compromised, having sustained such an injury? I got to ask that. And on the other side of that, have you ever been in a situation in a fight where you knew your opponent had a certain injury? Like, and the only reason I'm bringing this up is because of the leg lock. I'm like, did you drop back on that leg when the going got tough because you knew that there was an injury there? Did they mention it in the corner? Like, so I want to know, have you been the guy that's been going into a fight with an injury, and have you ever had an opponent that you knew had an injury going into a fight?
I have gone into a lot of fights with some sort of injury. The one that I remember absolutely most was going into that Danny Castillo fight, which was only my second fight in the UFC. I replaced Rustam Khabilov. Cowboy basically got me the fight. I had no business fighting Danny, who had way more experience. But anyway, at the time, I was, so by the book, so worried about everything. Cowboy wants to go snowboarding. We all went snowboarding. And I can talk about this now because obviously I still fought the fight. I didn't pull out from some fake injury or something like that. Otherwise, the UFC might come calling for some medical bills right now, but I didn't get it treated. But anyway, I crashed really bad on the mountain. He convinces me to get up there. I hurt my collarbone. Turns out I think I may have fractured my first rib. At the time, I thought I just dislocated this. It was like up here in my throat. And Dr. Hightower out in Albuquerque was able to work it in. And every day we just worked it in a little bit more and a little bit more. And I would get a little range of motion, but I wasn't sparring. I was barely running. I was just doing like Aerodyne sprint rounds over at the strength and conditioning out there in New Mexico. But I mean, look at what happened. I mean, I could barely even throw left hooks. And that was some of the best I've looked in a fight. But as far as an opponent, I don't remember anybody ahead of time really having an injury. When I was training for Al, the 2 times I was going to face him, I was really working on low leg kicks and calf kicks and things like that. Cause I it's a brutal game, but I know he's got bad knees. So we certainly weren't going to ignore that.
Yeah. And you didn't need the left hook when you got that spinning back fist in your arsenal. So, that's nice. That's a nice thing. That's a nice little ace you got up your sleeve there, Paulie. It's crazy when it comes to injuries and fights, because some of the best I've ever been physically going into a fight have been fights that I've lost. As on the other side of it, the fights I've gone into with crazy injuries have been some of my best performances. I had knee surgery 5 weeks before, no, 6 weeks before UFC 157. I had my meniscus completely scoped out. The UFC knew about it, but I was just like, I had a doctor that played college football. So he was just kind of like, well, a doctor would say you're out for like 8 weeks, but I had this same injury and the same surgery when I was playing football. So I ended up playing the next week. And so I was like,
Wow.
well, I'm going to listen to my doctor. So I went through with the fight and I won my UFC debut. And before the RDA fight, I had completely shattered my nose. I was just lucky it didn't displace, but 6 weeks before the fight, completely shattered my nose.
Yeah.
Didn't
I
spar
remember
the
you
whole
saying
camp.
that.
Didn't get touched. Just was like, had to go through this camp, not doing any live work. It was not fun going through that camp, but fortunately, I went through it to fight because I won. But and same as you, Paul, I've never really known an opponent of mine has an injury, but I've kind of been in that situation when I fought Anthony Pettis, double-edged sword going into a fight with injuries. I actually broke my foot 11 days prior to the fight, and I was at the PI and I was running around in a boot and trying to hide it from everybody. And I'm pretty sure Bilal saw me. I know Bilal and Pettis are boys, and hey, no harm, no foul. This is a brutal sport, man. So
Oh
sure enough,
boy.
I get Pettis on the fence in round one, and he's stomping the heck out of my foot. I'm like, you
We're gonna
guys,
have to have
you
we're
got
gonna have to
me.
have a
You got me.
conversation with them. We're gonna have a conversation
I
with
don't
them.
care. It's a brutal sport. No, I do it for my teammates, dude. If I saw my teammate's opponent running around in a boot at the PI, I'd be like, yo, homeboy's got a broken foot. Kick it, grab it, squeeze it,
Yeah.
punch it, do
Whatever you
whatever you got
gotta
to do.
do.
Attack that foot. Yeah.
Um, and just, to wrap up the other side pretty much. I know we talked a little bit about Cyril Gahn, but I mean, the guy goes and he wins. He's undefeated. He goes and wins the interim belt against Derek Lewis in his hometown. He comes out here against a former training partner, we'll say. We won't say they were ever best friends or teammates, right? And he loses. He's finally got an MMA professional loss. I mean, the guy is still so young, so fresh in his career, hasn't taken a ton of damage. I think he's going to learn so much from this, right? It just like you talked about, Michael, where Francis had to go through that kind of experience. Don't you think this is very similar where he's just going to go on, take the learned lessons that he got from being, maybe gassing out a little bit, maybe underestimating the full well-roundedness of his opponent, and you'll move on and you'll be a better fighter from here on out.
That's the as a competitor in the sport, it's one of those situations where when you win, you recognize what you did well. You like, oh, this is why I won this fight. This was great. There's something to celebrate. But when you lose, that's when you learn the lessons about what you need to do better. And those don't really come to the light when you win. When you win, you're so trapped in the moment of all the things you did well that led to you achieving that accomplishment of winning a fight in the UFC, which is a feat in itself. But it's when you lose. That's when you hit rock bottom and you go, what could I have done better? What am I lacking? What did I do wrong? You kind of got to look inward and make some adjustments. And that's where the most amount of growth happens in between fights. I've always grown the most between fights when I'm coming off a loss compared to when I win. And that's just the brutal reality of this sport. And with that being said, that's a scary thing to think about when you talk about Cyril Gahn. This is a guy, like you said, wins the interim title against Derek Lewis, has this tremendous run leading up to this moment with Francis Ngannou, and he's going to get better after this fight. He was already great. So I wouldn't be surprised if down the road we see these guys fight again. And I'm just throwing it out there. You never know. Cyril Gahn's that good. He's definitely going to fight his way back to the title. Outside of Francis Ngannou, I see him being the second best heavyweight in the UFC.
Yeah.
So that's a scary thought. Cyril Gahn's going to become a better fighter because of this